But maybe that's all a good ghost story is, a way of handing out consequences to the people who never get them in real life. And with that, happy Friday, and we're finally going to talk about an Alix E. Harrow book in a dedicated video with Starling House. Now, a deep cut, if you have been with me for a second, I have talked about both the 10,000 Doors of January and the Once and Future Witches in wrap-ups, but I have never done dedicated feature Fridays on them, and I have not yet read the short story novella retellings. And luckily, we are journeying into this dedicated video with Harrow's tightest work yet. Now, if you've been with me for a while and remember me talking about the 10,000 Doors of January and or the Once and Future Witches, no expectation of that. Clearly, because it's a deep cut, I went in excited, loving the premise, loving the fairy tale-esque nature of everything, especially in the kind of conception of her worlds. And I always left wanting something a little more or a little less in some cases. In the 10,000 Doors of January, there were a couple of things just kind of thrown in that didn't really feel resolved or like they went anywhere and didn't really fit within the world. I'm talking about the vampire of it all. And in the Once and Future Witches, the pacing kind of stalled out about halfway through the book, and I still can't get over that gosh dang tower. I know I yelled about it probably for a whole hour just by myself alone in book club because my book club has read both of these previous works, and they make great book club books because they are atmospheric, the language is lush, and there is still so much to discuss. And I think that is yet again the case with Starling House. And while I will not pretend that this is going to be everyone's cup of tea, this is evident just in my own kind of friends that I see rating the book on Goodreads. It seems very divisive. People are either loving it or they're not loving it. And I think that comes down to a couple of things. Harrow's language, which has always been a strength for me, can also be a little bit of a stumbling block in that it is very lush and could kind of veer into purple for some. Additionally, this particular title is billed as a kind of haunted house book in a long line of haunted house or sentient house books in the last year or so, and it does have that element, but it is not as present and forward in the narrative as you might think going in. And I almost commend Harrow on this in the sense that in things like the Once and Future Witches, she really got lost in her own ideas and being kind of enamored of those ideas. Case in point, the tower, right? And the kind of symbolism of the thing. Now, I'm not saying the symbolism of the thing is not present here. I am just saying it is much more intentionally directed because the symbolism of the thing is absolutely at play here. And I think the way that everything melds together in this book is just so beautifully done. And at just over 300 pages, she doesn't linger. She doesn't get lost in the narrative. Again, like I said with the Once and Future Witches, where the pacing got really mushy, especially after the halfway mark. Here, we have almost 3 very specific acts in terms of the action, and we have a protagonist who is compelling and interesting and spiky and really pushes everything along, which is important because we're throwing her against this kind of gothic, fairy tale-esque backdrop, and yet we have this kind of like sharp-mouthed, sarcastic point of view with our protagonist Opal that really kind of balances it out and also refines the original kind of fairy tale, because the darkness of the original fairy tales is definitely here, and the darkness of the fairy tales is part of the heart of this story with the Underlands, which again feels like it will be the central thing and instead is kind of kept in the background until it needs to be played. So it's kind of there, kind of providing the context for things, kind of providing a lingering question in my mind as a reader, but not overwhelming the narrative so that Opal, our protagonist, can shine. And you might be like, Melody, you haven't told us what this book is about. What is going on here? Which, fair point, I'm getting lost myself here. So here our protagonist Opal is a scrappy young adult who is also the primary caretaker for her younger brother, and she is attempting to raise funds to send him away to private school to get him out of this dying Kentucky town where they're judged for their poverty and the fact that they live at the motel. And she is working as many hours at the Tractor Supply as she can, and she may also be slipping her hands in the till, but one thing she tells us as a protagonist is that she is a liar. And this is important because the idea of lies, truth, storytelling, all of that is the heart of this story. It's the theme, it's the central kind of exploration here, and I think it's handled so, so well. And Opal lives an existence where she has had to kind of separate the wants and the needs, and she has had to throw the wants away. She cannot dream. She cannot allow herself to dream. All of her dreams now center around her brother and what she can do for him. But when she did dream, she dreamed of the Underlands, which was a fairy tale dark fantasy children's book written by Starling. And not only did Opal dream of the monsters within the Underlands, but she dreamed of Starling House, the rundown mysterious manor in the woods where the Starlings don't come into town. The groceries are left on the stoop, and occasionally new people will come into the house and kind of become Starlings, but they are not members of the town, so to speak, though they are woven into the lore of the town, especially in relation to the big family of the town that is in charge of the power company. And so there is all of this mythologizing around this town. But at the same time, what we as readers are seeing of this town is this poverty-stricken, or at least we're seeing the poverty-stricken side of it, dying, deindustrialized town. And so in her trek to and from work one day, because she cannot afford a car, she is walking through the woods and she happens upon Starling House. And this time she feeds a little bit of her blood inadvertently through the gate, and this gives her an in, though the proprietor of the house, Arthur, instructs her to run. But she doesn't run far or for long. She finds herself coming back, and in coming back, Arthur finds himself drawn to her and finds himself offering her a job as housekeeper, which will allow her to squirrel away money for her brother's future. And so she enters this world that is all hers in some ways, in a way that she's not had before. And it also offers her a peek into the Starlings, the most important of which is Arthur, and their kind of combative, really bantery relationship, the spikiness of it, and how that starts to soften both of them a little bit, and how they start to do favors for each other. And Arthur really starts to see the world outside of his house because he has been locked in this kind of epic solo battle in this house, and he is determined to be the last keeper of this house. So then it becomes the question of whether the house is intent on keeping Opal as well. Meanwhile, things are further complicated because Opal is approached by representatives for this power company that are trying to learn the secrets of this house and the way to acquire this house, basically so the power company can take it over and expand while they're already sucking all the life out of this town through the pollution they're causing, and yet at the same time, they are the main employer. And so we see this really kind of vicious cycle, and this is mirrored in the fairy tale-esque portions of the book and the history therein, because we see Opal really trying to get to the bottom of what this history is as these secrets start to open themselves within this house. And as she's being asked to find out more, it also opens up more doors and secrets within her own past and the past of her mother, who died in a car accident that she was a part of when she was younger, and how her mother was kind of flighty and also a liar but enigmatic, and just the complicated relationship Opal has with her mother and with her memory. And so we're told as readers, and Opal is told, the story of Starling House through varying points of view and perspectives as she is kind of learning more about it. We get the kind of common gossip tale of town, then we get a more twisted take on that from Black residents, and really explores the kind of whitewashing of history in small towns such as this, and the way we kind of gloss over the sins of the past in many ways. And the first tale really dives into this idea of the mythologizing of small towns. So I really, really love everything it's doing here, and it's also balanced out. Those aren't the only tales, to be clear, but I'm not going to spoil all of them. Not that I really spoiled those, but it also kind of grapples here with truth and storytelling in relation not only to the kind of fairy tale nature of things once we go into the house, but in a small town, what kind of stories can be spun. And we see these stories maybe not delineated in storytelling like some of these others are in the narrative, but in the way that these rumors perpetuate, and we hear these secondhand rumors from the people around Opal, and the way that she also kind of brushes it off. And so even as she is telling us as a narrator over and over again that she is a liar, we are also seeing her be the most truthful in some ways, because she tells us that she's a liar. She tells us that she is a thief. And so we're seeing Opal, who as a reader we see as a fighter and struggling against this place that has judged her since she was a child for her circumstances. And we're seeing in some ways her be the most truthful, because everyone in town is engaging in this mythologizing or looking at gossip as a form of storytelling in a lot of ways, which I thought was really well done, especially because she really held herself back. There were moments in the Once and Future Witches where we were really hit over the head as readers with the ideas. And here, it wasn't that they were subtle by any means, because the narrative really did make them evident, but she didn't, you know, kind of direct audience address it to us. And so it wasn't as blunt and didactic. It was still there, it was still forward and obvious, but just a little bit subtler. And I loved this idea and this kind of juxtaposition as well of this kind of dying town, which it may seem weird that I'm talking so much about this town in this book that is centered around this haunted house. And yet it really kind of matched the Gothic aesthetic. And I think it then bridged that greater theme as well. What are both hiding? Because there are definite secrets in this house, but it takes a while to get there. So the first third is kind of almost just getting Opal into the house. The middle third is kind of establishing this new normal, warming up to Arthur, then getting closer, the kind of complication of the relationship with her brother, learning more about her town, her history, the people that she's always considered constants in her life, even as she's considered herself much a lone wolf, and learning that maybe she has more companionship and there are people she can lean on when she didn't realize that that was there for her. And then the final third is really grappling with the underland of it all, and that's where we get a lot of the more fantastical elements. We see the house as a more sentient kind of presence prior to that. We see the way it shuffles things into Opal's presence, like letters from Arthur's parents. We also see some things from Arthur's point of view, so we get to go back and forth. We are primarily with Opal, but we do move over to Arthur occasionally, and so we as readers have a little bit more idea of what exactly is going on, and this idea that he is kind of set against this epic quest to be fighting these monsters that are coming up seemingly from the basement. But it becomes evident fairly early on that the house isn't the enemy here. It has just become an enemy for Arthur because it represents the way he feels trapped, and then his kind of emotional interior is reflected in the house because he has left it to crumble, but it's Opal that comes and helps restore it. So again, not necessarily subtle, but we're also allowed to kind of get there ourselves, which I really appreciate, and I think it shows growth and restraint in Harrow's storytelling. I'm not going to spoil the kind of fantasy angle of it all, though it is kind of lighter fantasy. It's much more atmospheric, it's much more gothic in terms of us seeing it nominated for a fantasy award. Although I obviously am leaning toward voting for this, I still need to read Amina El-Sarafi. But I will say the kind of resolution, the emotional kind of climax and height of this did remind me of the emotional height and climax and resolution of What Stalks Among Us by Sarah Hollowell. Not the same by any means, but definitely kind of exploring similar themes. And I think both have this real nuance and understanding and forgiveness. And part of this is in the storytelling in Starling House as well. We're seeing the story from all these different angles, the kind of beginnings of Starling House. What happened to Eleanor Starling? And the beginning of Eleanor Starling and Starling House is almost presented as this kind of Winchester-esque house. This idea that the house moves and rooms aren't necessarily always in the same place, but also that they don't really have any logic to them. And so it's really a physical manifestation of the emotional interior in a lot of ways, in a way that a lot of the successful haunted house books are, yet here the kind of sentience of the house is really reined in. It is not as forward or present as I personally expected it to be in the narrative, nor is the Underland, this kind of dark fairy tale, as present as I expected it to be in the narrative. It's referenced, we know the kind of protagonist of it, we know the kind of shape of it, that it has these dark, gruesome images that scared children, that there was this supposed children's movie movie cartoon made in the 80s that they scrapped because children were throwing up. There is this sense to it, and yet it's never like fully spoken into being within the narrative. And so I found that really interesting, and I think very successful, because then as readers, we're allowed to conjure whatever related to that. And also in that conjuring, the kind of reflection of monsters in the book, which I'm going to read a bit from later in the book, and the kind of exploration or introduction of these beasts and monsters for the first time. So if you don't want any of that spoiled, skip ahead a little bit. But I thought that this language is really indicative, one, of Harrow's voice, if you're not familiar with it, in addition, of course, to what I read at the beginning of this, but also the kind of state of what we're exploring here with these monsters, with the supernatural, the fantasy angle of this. It says, it's as if someone had given a child a piece of white chalk and told her to draw a wolf, but the only thing she knew about wolves was that they frightened her. And so we're really looking at that inner psychology here and where monsters come from, but then kind of complicating that, providing some nuance to that, providing some grace to that, like I think we've seen in Harrow's narratives before. Here, I just think that she has, one, kind of tightened and reined herself in terms of the storytelling, and two, I think that her language is utilized to its full potential here, because she's already kind of lush, poetic, very languid in a lot of ways, and it really fits the fairy tale nature of this, while also having this kind of sharp, sarcastic bite to it that kind of modernizes everything and like plays in to those instincts and those origins of the dark fairy tale, but also gives us a kind of modern lens to it. I also love the way the relationship between Opal and Arthur is handled here. As you can probably guess, based on what I've kind of talked about so far, there is a kind of romantic leaning there. However, it's handled very organically. I would be very interested. I almost hope we do read this for book club, because I've mentioned my good friend Mandy before. Mandy doesn't like romance. However, I think that this may be okay because it's not over the top to my reading. That being said, it may be too much, and I will respect it. But I think it's handled really well because we see them both as these kind of sharp and spiky kind of characters. They're very protective of themselves in different ways. Opal's gonna lash out first, she's gonna bite. Arthur is gonna kind of bite and attack in his own way, but he's much colder and will kind of wall you off. And so we see them kind of face off against each other in this way, and they're able to match each other and break down those walls. And so it's a lot, as you would imagine, of kind of sexual tension and dancing around each other, and these like little comments that start to wear them down, and then we get to see them showing up for each other in these more dramatic ways that are really satisfying because of that, and because we are then seeing them grow as characters as well and letting someone else in. And the loneliness for both of these characters kind of permeates the novel, and it really kind of reflects it back on us as readers, because I definitely think that that idea of loneliness and companionship and what those are and what they mean and what we give for those we love and what that may cost us and what may be taken from us without our permission in some cases, all of that is kind of being explored as well. But luckily, with no towers. Now, there is still a kind of liminal space outside of everything where we have to figure some stuff out, but we have to get there. It's the journey, we've earned it, and it's that kind of like dreamscape at the end of everything where you're really facing off against the harshest truths. Now, all that being said, I do think that the language, like I've mentioned, is one of the real standouts of this, and it's either really gonna work for you or it's really not, I think. I don't know that there's much middle ground for Harrow's language. Some people may feel like we're getting kind of lost in the weeds with it, and that's fair. It works for me, but I recognize it's not going to work for everyone. We also have with this footnotes that kind of interject in the narrative and provide additional context, which lead us to believe that this is collected in some way, and so it provides this extra layer on top of the narrative in terms of what lens we are reading this through. But I also do think that the language is really balanced between the poetic and the relatable. Like I said, there is this kind of fluffiness that is immediately kind of undercut with the sharpness or a sarcastic jab from Opal. So I think that that's handled really well. It doesn't get lost in itself. There's something to temper that, and I think that's part of Opal's strength as a character as well. Now, why I think that this is particularly important is because it sets the tone and the atmosphere, and it's one of the hallmarks for me as a reader for an Alix Harrow book. However, if you noticed, when I held up the book, it had a nice little convenient Reese's Book Club sticker on it. We don't like the stickers. we're all on the same page there. But that means that there is the possibility that this could be optioned for the screen. And I'm very interested in the idea of that because this will be a kind of tricky translation, I think. Because so much of it is internal, it's this idea of the voice of the piece and also the way storytelling is explored within the narrative itself through these kind of breakaway stories, through this kind of shifting of perspective, the subtleties there. And again, that language is creating a lot of the atmosphere. Now, all that being said, all of that tone and that atmosphere can be communicated visually with a deft hand, absolutely. But I think it will be interesting to see how some of that internal plays externally, and I think one of the reasons it may work is that we do have this physical embodiment of the house as a reflection of the internal, because here again, the house isn't necessarily haunted, like it is, but it isn't, and in many ways it's also a caretaker, and this concept of home really is the kind of glue holding everything together. Because here we have a protagonist in Opal who's never had a home, and we also have Arthur who has never felt at home in his. So there is so much to dig into with this book, but I'm gonna try and rein myself in from just babbling on about it. And I would be very interested to hear your thoughts about the newest Alix E. Harrow, because I know a lot of people have already read it. So if you are one of those who has read it, let me know how this worked for you. Let me know how the balance of the voice worked for you, how you think that this lines up against Harrow's previous work, and just what you're thinking about it all. But as always, thank you for hanging out and listening to my thoughts. Read something good, and yeah, bye.